I realize that people don't care how my life turns out. People aren't thinking about me nearly as much as I think they are. That the person on the phone who says no to my sales pitch, as soon as I hang up, they've forgotten about me. I mean, this is not about me and all my anxieties and my ego and my, oh, people don't like me and all that crap, okay?
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, and welcome to today's episode. On today's show we have Jo Cerio, and we're talking about fear, the impact that it has both in our business lives and then in our lives in general, and how we can go about eliminating it. Jo himself is an international speaker, trainer and an author of the book Overcoming Fear, which dives exactly into what we're talking about today. So if you enjoy this episode, it's probably worth a download or a buy on Amazon. You can find out more about Jo over at jocerio.com. Everything that we talk about is available in the show notes to this episode over at salesman.red. And with all that said, let's jump into today's show. Hey Jo, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast. You are more than welcome. We're going to dive into a topic that I think, and we touched on this before we just clicked record then, a topic that's going to spill over from sales into just hopefully the audience's lives in general and add real value to them. And already I can feel a good vibe with you, Jo, and I feel this is going to be a good show. So I want to talk about two things, and they might be the same, they might not be the same, I'm not sure. That's fears that salespeople have, and then also the fear of selling. But before we get into all that, give us a bit of context here. Do you have a definition of how you define fear? Because obviously it encompasses perhaps lots of different angles.
Yeah, it does. It's so much. And so many of us talk about stress and anxiety. It's almost popular or fashionable to talk about stress. I'm so stressed out. I'm so stressed out. But the fact of the matter is, when you dig inside of that stress, it's couched in fear. And fear, to me, is an emotion that's driven by a belief that there's something that can hurt you, right? That's a very broad, you can drive a truck through that definition. But this idea that inside of my head, I have certain experiences. I tell my audiences, I ask them, what do you see with? And they say, your eyes. I say, no, you see through your eyes, and you see with your brain. And you see with the experiences and the interpretations that you made over time. So I have in my head a set of experiences that creates true fear or good fear in my life. I get bitten by a snake. I know snakes are dangerous. Snakes are really dangerous. And then more than that, much bigger than that, is all this fake fear, all this false fear that I created in my head. And sales is just rife with these. I created this belief in my mind, or this sensitivity in my head about how things might turn out. And the reality is that stuff isn't real.
And before we get any further, how much of our day-to-day, and we can bundle it all together, of stress, anxiety, of quote-unquote fear, how much of it is complete nonsense and how much of it is actually useful?
Yeah, I think obviously it depends on where you're coming from, what kind of job you have, what your life looks like.
Whether you're a snake handler or not, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you're a snake handler, you probably don't have a lot of fear of snakes. You know what I mean? So anyway, and we'll get back
let me just stop on that for a second. This leads on to my next question. You've set that up very nicely. So is fear almost a paradox then? And where I'm going with this is there a trend and a trait of successful people, both in sales and just in life in general, in and out of business? Are they good at dealing with fear?
Yeah. So here's the thing about the snake handler, and in an answer to your question, the snake handler understands snakes. Snake handler is not just a person that walks into a snake pit and says, "Oh, I'm going to grab up one of these things." Hopefully, at minimum, they've read a couple of books, they've been to some trainings, and they've watched a YouTube video. You know what I mean? And they go into that snake pit, and all of us go into the snake pit, literally or figuratively, either being prepared or not being prepared. Either understanding the rules of the game and the logic inside of the game, right? Every game has its logic. every snake pit, the snake handler walks into the snake pit and he says, I understand snakes. I understand how they behave. I understand how they move. I understand what scares them. And I understand how to capture them, right? How to catch them. In my mind, there's no difference between the snake handler and a seasoned, experienced, mindful salesperson. The salesperson who's afraid is the person that goes into the pit and hasn't figured out, what am I afraid of? What's the logic of this game? What are the rules of this game? When somebody says no to me, it's not about me. Just all that stuff that I'm sure we'll get more into. But it's like, what is going on inside of the game? And people who are fearful are usually people that are standing on the edge or outside and haven't figured out what are the dynamics inside of that game. And what is it that I'm bringing into that game from a personal perspective, from a psychological, belief-driven perspective? And what is it like we wink, right? I wink at you, Will, and I say, oh, yes, this is the game. I see what he's doing. Aha, that salesperson's saying no. That means I have to contact him again 3, 4, 5 times more because I understand the game. I understand that this may not be the right time. I understand that he may not have the budget. I understand that, all those things. The person who freaks out and runs is the person that doesn't get the game.
And let me jump in here for a second, because we're covering a lot of ground very quickly. Yeah, which is awesome, because I can see that we're going to jump down some rabbit holes here. But I want to stop on this point because I don't want to forget about it and not come back to it. Yep. How much of getting past fear, and we'll talk about whether fear is a good thing or a bad thing, being on the edge, whether that's good or bad later on, right, when we're talking about pushing ourselves and that kind of thing. But how much of getting past fear is knowing the game, knowing the logic, to use your terminology there, and how much of it is experience? How much of it can we get past by reading a book or watching a YouTube video versus how much of it do we need to just dive in and get on with it?
So your original question, which I artfully just totally ignored, what percentage of our day is fear, anxiety, stress, whatever? And I don't know what the number is, right? But I think it's something like 70, 80, 90% is the fake fear that we create and we lean on to make excuses, okay? And now, because my mind is so scattered, you have to remind me of that more recent question.
So what I'm getting at is how much of getting past fear is using your logic, is watching a YouTube video, reading a book, versus how much of it is just going, sod it, I'm jumping in, feet first. It might be a total mess, but and obviously there's a process leading up to that. Right.
I think it's a combination of those two things. You can't do this, from my perspective, you can't do this without practice. You can't sit back. It's like, I learned to ride a bicycle by reading this book on how to ride a bicycle, right? It doesn't happen that way. And, I have my friend Will, and Will and I always have these conversations that end up in arguments and fights. Well, I've got to figure out a couple of things. I've got to, hopefully read or talk to somebody or YouTube video, and then I've got to try my new approach with Will. And then when it works and our conversation ends successfully, I say, oh, I did it. Awesome. Let me try it again with somebody else. Let me keep practicing. So I think it's a combination. And in my experience, it certainly has been a combination of reading, studying, videos, talking to people who are good at sales, talking to people who are good at managing fear, talking to people who are good at conversation, and then putting it into practice and falling down and getting up and falling down and getting up.
Put this into context for us. What is something that you've been fearful of in the not too distant past that you've overcome? And then we can dive into that perhaps. And I've got a good example for myself as well.
Well, I'll tell you what, that question alone could take us the whole time because essentially I was afraid of everything growing up. So most recently, I spent most of my life in academic settings. And when you're in an academic setting, I was... in terms of my background, you probably read about the Russian mafia stuff. So I spent a long time in Russia. I was investigating the Russian mafia, all that kind of thing. But I spent a lot of time in universities. and I made X number of dollars a month. And trust me, it's not all that much. And so when my wife said, I believe in you, I think you're awesome, I've watched you with audiences, you need to go do this with your own company. So that stepping off point and the sales point and having in my imagination, oh my God, can I make more than $3,000 a month? Oh, if I don't, then what if we lose the house? And, all of this stuff, before I understood the internal logic for my audience of sales, of what the financial, what the economic limits are. And so I got to a point where year 1 was okay. Year 2, I understood a little more, doubled the business. Year 3 was flat. I studied a little more, went out, made mistakes, fell down, got up, doubled the business again the year after that. And it's just, you start realizing that the fear is the thing that holds us back. Because when we're going through, life with sweaty palms, right? When we're going through life with this fear-based, we lock out the possibility of learning as much or as effectively, as efficiently as we could. All right. So once I understood that, and once I understood my market, and I got really clear about where I was going, it increased the logic, it increased the understanding of the game, and the fear started shifting and morphing and decreasing.
So your process was...
It doesn't go away, by the way. It doesn't go away.
We'll come on to that because I think that's a really important point, and we'll spend some time on that. But do you... And again, I'm talking about trends here, perhaps, and you may or may not have data on some of this, but and anecdotally as well, you seem to then you know where you want to go. There's fear, that's a barrier. So you've done a bit of work, research, learning, and then you take a educated step forward to get past that fear. That seems like one way of going about it. I tend to go the opposite way of burning the bridges, diving in feet first, and either sink or swim. And the irony is that I've never really failed massively at anything, so I'm obviously not pushing myself hard enough. That's if I had a coach that I was having this conversation with, that's what I imagine they would tell me. Is this a binary? Are some people just made to jump in, and some people made to be more sensible about it and getting past fear through education and steps forward? Or are we all built for a mix of both?
Yeah, I think it's both. One thing I don't like about the world in general, and we see this a lot now with the elections in the States, is the world, like you said, binary, right? It's black and white. It's this is what I do all the time. It's like, no. Sometimes somebody invited me to speak before I was fully comfortable speaking in front of large groups. Somebody said, hey, we want you to speak at our conference. It's 1,000 people. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And then I backed up and said, holy shit, what have I done? Now I got to figure out how to get into this thing. But it's like, sometimes it's, I'm in a screw it mentality. And it's like, you know what? I'm going to call 50 CEOs today and I'm going to have great conversation. And sometimes I'm just like, you know what? I got to work my way into it. And I don't get hung up. I've watched myself a lot and I've watched people a lot who they get hung up and they're wringing their hands and they go through all this mental anguish. And yeah, I have days like that. And there are other days I'm just like, you know what? I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm from. I know what barriers I've crossed. So suck it up and just get to work. And the fact of the matter is we are first and foremost emotional beings. And first and foremost, we have to grapple with this stuff. And sometimes you wake up and you're like, oh, all the crap from my childhood is right in the front of my brain. And I was rejected so much, there's no way I'm picking up the phone today. And that takes more effort. Sometimes it takes more planning and plotting. And sometimes it's just like, you know what? Screw it. I'm not doing anything for the next 3 hours.
So you bring up a brilliant point here, Joe. Should we be trying to a certain extent, psychoanalyze ourselves and deal with where this fear is coming from? Because again, you might have the opposite view on this than me, but I know from personal experience, if I've ever been scared of something, I'll jump in, get it done, and then The way I always describe it is I screw it up into a tiny little ball and throw it back to the back of my brain. And just as before we click record, I touched on that analogy as well of it might mean that I'll be successful, but might burn out in 10 years or have a nervous breakdown or something of that nature. But that is how I tend to deal with things. And this might be a stupid, overly masculine, I've got no emotions kind of way of dealing with it. But is that okay? Or do we need to coax out and get to the bottom of fears before we can get past them?
Yeah, I don't like the word before, before we can get past them, because you mentioned a word earlier that I think is really critical, and that's experience. If you roll yourself up in a ball and put yourself in a corner and say, "Oh, what if, and I can't handle being embarrassed. I can't handle people laughing at me. I can't handle all this stuff," and you don't do anything. That was me. Okay, that was me probably in my 20s more than any other time, where I was just like, and I went through the motions, and I kind of, I created a lot of illusions. I projected a certain look to people outside of myself, but that was me. I was rolled up into a ball and said, I can't, what if? So you have a choice. You can say, what if, or you can say, let's see. Let's see what happens if I try this. And here's one of the things. Maybe this is one of the more powerful tools that I started using was I realized that people don't care how my life turns out. People aren't thinking about me nearly as much as I think they are. That the person on the phone who says no to my sales pitch, as soon as they hang up, they've forgotten about me. I mean, this is not about me and all my anxieties and my ego and people don't like me and all that crap, okay? Back to the original question, for me, it's been very important to understand where some of my fear came from, because I had to understand the logic of that game as well, right? So let me just take a small little kind of personal detour here. I'm the ninth of 12 kids. I grew up with a Sicilian volcano of a father, and long story short, I had to figure out, where did all that come from? I get a 97 on an exam. My father says, what happened to the other 3 points? And I grew up just afraid of everything. And unfortunately, he passed away when I was about 23. But in my 20s and my 30s, I had to go back and unpack that. And I realized my father was born in 1920. He was an immigrant. He lived through the Great Depression. He had a certain way of looking at the world. That's not the way I grew up. And his ideal or his striving was for security rather than freedom. And he was also an emotionally locked down person. So for me personally, it worked for me to go back and dig through where I thought my fear came from and what it was I was trying to get, i.e. the pat on the head from dad, and realize at some point that he was incapable of doing that, and realize at some point that his mindset, the logic of that game, of that relationship between me and him, was based on his belief system coming out of immigrant and Great Depression experience, okay? And then understanding, and here's a cornerstone piece for me. I had to understand what was my father's junk and what's my junk. And I can't confuse those two things. What is the nature of the selling game and what is the junk of the other person on the other end of the line, and what's my junk? If someone starts yelling at me on the telephone, I know that's a person that's not very well balanced. I'm not taking ownership of them yelling at me. I'm not getting afraid because of their inability to handle a normal conversation, right? So to that extent, yes, I want to know where things are coming from. I want to know, is this me projecting my stuff onto the person I'm trying to pitch? Or is this that person really is locked down in fear and expressing it in a really messed up way? I don't have to own that.
So it seems like this
makes sense.
It makes total sense. It seems like there's two angles here, Joe. From one side of things, you've got to be mature and take responsibility for yourself, your own actions, your own thoughts, And then the other side of it seems like there's an argument for improving your emotional intelligence to be able to break past fear as well. Is that something that in this situation we do again through experience?
Yeah, here's the number one thing. For me, the number one step, and I've seen this, we talk about reading books. You can read the Bible, you can read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you can read the literature on emotional intelligence, pop psychology, inspirational, motivational, whatever. And they're all going to tell you the same thing. And they're going to tell you that your road to success, however you define it, your road to excellence and all this stuff, and your road to great relationships and everything else runs directly through 2 major things. One is self-awareness, and the other is mistakes and failure. And I want to put that in quotes, right? Mistakes. And when I realized that my success or the road to excellence goes directly through mistakes and failure, I shifted my perspective about mistakes and failure. And because my fear was based on mistakes and failure, because they're a bad thing. You got a 97 on the test. What happened to the other 3 points? You are not worthy. And I realized that perspective was not my issue. It was my father's issue, or society's issue, or this wrong-headed way of looking at success. That's why I love entrepreneurs. Take Richard Branson or, whoever, Bill Gates. And these guys know, fall down, get up, fall down, get up. It doesn't reflect on your worth as a human being. That message I didn't understand in my teens, my 20s.
And how did you come to understand it? Because it's one thing to just say that sentence. I'm not sure how you would go about implementing that if you didn't. I feel like I've got a relatively high self-worth. I've come from not a super successful family, but a really loving. My family and childhood is as good as it gets, essentially. And I feel like that gives me this, this self-worth. But so I can't really put into context how I feel I'd improve it. Is there a method? How did you go through that?
So there are a couple of things. One was the reading and I read a ton, and I've read a lot on these emotional intelligence and fear and what keeps people down and all that. So that was a huge piece of it. The other thing is I've done a lot of cross or multidisciplinary work. So I've done a lot on crime. I've done a lot on cultural, on geographic, on politics, on psychology. And you start seeing that the message gets repeated. It almost doesn't matter what discipline you're in, right? And you look at inmates, for example. I've worked with tons of criminal justice systems and inmates. Their fear isn't that different from mine. Okay, they just happen to get caught and put behind bars. Okay, the second thing that really helped me a lot was I had 1 or 2 people around me that put things in perspective. I had a friend who got divorced at about 30. She had nothing. She tried to get her husband to go to therapy, blah, blah, blah. He refused. She left him. She had no house, no furniture, no nothing. And she said, okay, I'm starting over. And she got really clear on what she wanted. She got really clear on 3 cornerstone questions. And to me, these 3 cornerstone questions factor into, I don't care if we're talking about sales or public speaking or writing a book or whatever. And these cornerstone questions are, number 1, who are you? Now, admittedly, these are huge questions, right? Number 1, who are you? Number 2, what do you want? And number 3, how are you going to get it? And the problem is when we're locked down in fear, we forget those questions. When we're locked down in fear, we take the fear and we bend it and stretch it and make it bigger than it actually is because we keep it inside our head and say, oh my God, people are going to think this about me if I do this. And if I look like what if I wear a sweatshirt on this podcast and we're on video and I'm unshaven and what people are going to think about. And a lot of people go through those mental gymnastics constantly. But the problem is this: if we take time to define, I call it COP, which is maybe appropriate coming from law enforcement. A COP is clarity of purpose. And when I get really clear about what I want, about where I'm going, it's going to help define how I'm going to get there. And after a while, the fear has to be put in its place because when I answer those questions, the trick is, do I answer them as specifically as possible? Very quick example. I couldn't lose weight. And I didn't lose weight because in my head, I said to myself, I want to lose weight. And maybe like salespeople's, I want to have money. I want to be rich. I want to be the best salesman. Your brain can't get around that. Your brain doesn't know what that means. So when I put as specific as possible framework on all of my questions, right? I want to lose weight. No. I am going to lose 17 pounds between January 1st and February 15th. SMART goals, right? We've all heard about SMART goals. I'm going to lose 17 pounds between January 1 and February 15th. I'm going to read one book on how to lose weight from cover to cover instead of faking, buying 50 books and pretending that I'm reading them when I'm really not, right? Same thing with sales. 50 books on sales and I'm going to be the best salesperson in the world. It's a self-defeating exercise. I buy one book on sales. I buy one book on how to lose weight. I do everything that the person in that book tells me to do. I follow it like a cooking recipe. And I lost 45 pounds. And that weight, when I shifted my mindset about how to approach it, the weight came off very easily. When I shifted my mindset about sales and about my company and about who I'm serving and why, we're at a point now where our revenue, our potential revenue, is much higher than I ever would have believed possible, because I was looking at my original revenue from a fear perspective. And these days I look at my potential revenue and my current revenue as a let's see, rather than, what if I make a mistake? What if? It's let's see, let's go try. The worst thing that happens, screw it up. It bombs. Okay. Why did it bomb? Did it bomb because of the way I did it? Or did it bomb because it doesn't have a market actually in reality? And you go through those questions and you're just like, okay, what's next? Let's go try something else.
You've given me an aha here, Joe. Interestingly, from how you're talking about this, the specifics that help you get through and your brain to look back in on itself and give feedback so it can make progress. The last thing that I was, and this is going to sound ridiculous to both yourself, everyone who's watching and listening to this now, but I think I like to try and get off my high horse as much as what I can on the show. But I was really nervous about taking the podcast from an audio podcast to a video podcast. I used the excuses of, I needed a little set, I needed better cameras, I needed to have a certain production quality. I procrastinated on all of this. I bought one camera and then I bought another. So the camera, I won't pull it out now, but there's a camera over there. There's another one box of just junk down here that I didn't need. And what got me motivated and got me past this, because I was comfortable doing the audio side of things, and I was using the fact that for the video side of things, it's loads more work to edit a video show than it is, and to put it together and to upload it and do all that kind of stuff, than it is just the audio side of things. And what got me through it and made me commit was by not saying, rephrasing and reframing the question. So what the question I was asking myself was, or I was demanding of myself, was that I should do a video podcast. That was it. That's all that was going around in my brain. That all changed, as you just alluded to then, of when I reframed the question of how do I get more downloads for the whole thing? How do I get more attention? How do I reach more people and make more of an impact? And the biggest leverage that I had at the time was to do a video show, not because people will watch the videos necessarily. So each of the audio shows get between 10 and 20,000 downloads. The videos get anywhere from 100 to 1,000 over a few months. So that isn't the main thing here, but we cut the video up into smaller chunks, put it over social, gives us loads more content at the same amount of time. It's a no-brainer in reality, and I was still nervous and fearful of doing it. But reframing the question into something that I could really get behind made me go, I guess, around the fear, because the fear was that I was going to look stupid, but right. I was actually happy to look stupid to reach more people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect sense. And you put your finger, you said a couple of very key words. One was comfortable, right? The question is, can we get comfortable with being uncomfortable? That's one of the keys. The second is you use the P word, procrastination. And people say, oh, I'm a terrible procrastinator. I procrastinate a lot. What is procrastination if not fear in a different form? And I tell my audiences, I say, look, if you're sitting in front of the television, there are two reasons you're sitting in front of the television. One of two reasons. Number one, you are celebrating having worked a great day. You deserve it. You're rewarding yourself. You're hanging out with your family, or you're avoiding what's in the other room. You're avoiding doing your taxes. You're avoiding figuring out how to do a video podcast. And because in the back of your head, it's like, oh, I don't want people to look at my glasses and my hair and unshaven and my brick wall in the back and, whatever, all this stuff, right? And we make up all these excuses and this language in our heads. That's what I'm talking about when we say we have to raise our level of self-awareness, right? We loop back to emotional intelligence. And this is the point I was driving toward when we're talking about 7 habits of highly effective people and all that stuff. It's how do I raise my self-awareness? And you just gave us a perfect example. You just illustrated that whole point. How do I raise my self-awareness to understand why am I doing what I'm doing? And you can elect to run back and dig into your mother, your father, your past, whatever, if you think you need it, if that's the source. And maybe you say, no, it's not the source, so I'll go forward. For me, the source is the narrative that we tell ourselves. Why is it you think, why is it that you procrastinate? Why is it you think that, video is going to be so difficult. I don't want to look at the camera. I don't want people to see me, all that. I don't want someone to say no to me on the phone, so I put off. And people just say, no, I'm so busy. I was so busy today, I couldn't do my calls. Say, no, your calls are your job. That is your job. And we create all this stuff in our heads to justify putting off our calls. But what we don't typically do is go to the point of self-awareness to realize that we're putting off the calls because my mother and my father, when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, said, you'll never amount to anything. You have a funny voice. You sound ridiculous on the phone. All this stuff that we got emotionally invested in, we carried that message to now. And we mask it in excuses and bullshit that keep us stuck in our seats, that keep us stuck in our place, and keep us from stepping over that line to go out of your comfort zone. Such a critical point. I mean, you raised all the massive ones, right? Can I step over that line of my comfort zone? And the last one I want to say that you raised was habit number 2 in the 7 habits of highly effective people. Begin with the end in mind. When we shift to say, here's the goal, very clear and precise, now our brain is going to work to say, how can I get to that point? And I'm going to do things that previously I was uncomfortable with, or I didn't read a book about, or I didn't watch a video, or I didn't talk to anybody, or I didn't go talk to other podcasters. What's the most natural thing to do? Go talk to another podcaster and say, how in God's name did you set up your video? Right? But most of us don't even do that. We say, oh my God, I'm living in the most technologically open and flexible time in our life to this point. All of the answers are out there. We know how to put a man on the moon. We know how to put a machine on Mars. We know how to make $1 million. We know how to get great grades in school. But we just get stuck in our heads and say, I can't pick up the phone. What if the man will say no? There's 100 books on what to do about objections in sales. What do you mean, what if the man says no? This is clearly about you and not about the technology of getting past objections, because all that stuff is out there. You know what I mean?
Let me ask a massively leading question here, and I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is going to be. So we are now doing a killer sales video podcast, millions of downloads per episode. We're really excited. We're, reaping all the benefits of all the hours and the work. We are excellent at cold calling. We're cleaning up. We're doing massive revenue for our company. We've expanded our comfort zone that far. Now, is there a point where we stop going to the edge and stop expanding that comfort zone? Is it okay to, and again, I say it's a leading question, but I don't know. Having got it out of my brain into the airwaves here, is it okay at some point to just go, do you know what? I've got the house I want. I've got the car I want. I've got my little family. I've got X amount of money coming in a month from my sales job. I'm killing it. I'm always in the top 10%. Is it okay? And is it healthy? And are you going to continue to be happy if you just say, right, I'm here now. I don't need to go to the edge anymore?
You put your finger on another, I mean, you're good at this game, right? Is you put your finger on another massive issue. And that is this. One way we loop back to the three questions. So, are you clear about what you want? Who am I? What do I want? How am I going to get it? Who says I have to be in the top 10%? Maybe my lifestyle and my philosophy, my spirituality, my family relationship says top 20% is good enough. Do I need to buy this car, buy that house, live in that neighborhood? It's like, forget about everybody else. And that's the second point, is the should and these modalities, right? I should, I must, I have to. It's like, says who? Says who? My wife and I have been in this shift ourselves over the last 5 years to go into the space where we say, hey, we just went to Cancun for the first time in our lives. And then we come up with this idea that, hey, why can't we go to Cancun 4 times a year? And there's a thing in my head that says, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. I don't deserve it. I don't have enough money. Right, all that fear stuff. I didn't grow up like that. We had 12 kids in the family. We never went on vacation. And we're making that shift and saying, why not? Why can't we have our lifestyle? Our lifestyle. I don't care if Will likes it. I don't care if Will looks down on me for it. I don't care if Will says, oh, Cancun, that's not Fiji. Whatever. Who cares? Here's the bottom line. I don't care what you think about me. You know what I mean? And then when we get into this game that I'm playing my game, I'll give you a quick example. And 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, whenever it was, I said to my wife, and I said to a colleague that I work with on some projects in California, I said to them, here's a challenge. I want you to understand or to figure out or to imagine how we make $200,000 a month. Okay? There's no way in God's green earth that I would ever utter a phrase like that, even 5 years ago. Because my academic mentality is, I'm making $3,000 a month. That's the limit, right? And we're prisoners of our limits. And then, you make $5,000 a month. I go, oh my God, you make $10,000 a month. You make $20,000 a month, $35,000. It's like, okay, how do I get to the next one? How do I get to the next one? At that point, you're inside the game. And you understand that my clarity is $200,000 a month. And then my clarity is, here's my market. And my clarity is, what is it my clients want? It can't be about me anymore. Right? The $200,000 a month may come or will come when I figure out what the biggest pain points for my clients are. And I stop selling them. And I build a relationship with them and understand them and listen to them. And they say, oh, we really need this. And I say, great, I can figure that out. Let's do it. I mean, this just happened to me 2 weeks ago. They said, we want a leadership academy. I said, great. I'll figure out a leadership academy. And 3 years ago, I'm like, oh, leadership academy, that's going to take me a year to figure out. I did it in 3 days. Okay? It's like, wow, there's another pillar of my business that in and of itself would be multiple 6 figures, if not more, right? And then all of a sudden you have this mind shift and you say, damn, I spent so many years locked down in fear, believing all this stuff that I told myself and I received from the outside world. And then you have this shift and say, you know what? What's possible? That's the bottom line. What is possible?
We're running out of time here, so because this is a whole conversation in itself. But keep it. If you can keep this answer short, we'll run through a couple of questions that we go through with every guest, and we'll wrap up with that. But Jo, coming from academia, you will have a unique perspective on this, which is why I want to ask you: why aren't these kind of things taught to 7-year-olds in schools?
Because at some point we shifted from hands, heart, and head to reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's the short answer.
Very succinct. I don't know what I was expecting, but that explains it. And thank you for narrowing it down in so succinctly. That was awesome. Okay, I've got a couple of questions, Jo, that I ask everyone that comes on the show. First one: who is the world's greatest salesperson?
The world's greatest salesperson There's so many names that you can mention. Here's what I think it is. It's the person who engages and connects, puts their ego on the side, and builds a relationship with the specific market they're trying to serve. That's who I think it is. And if you can do that, I think you're in good shape.
Good stuff.
You know,
you've mentioned.
We can argue about who that might be, but
sure. You've mentioned 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and a couple of other books, but what is one other book, other than your own, which we'll come on to, that you'd recommend to the Salesman Podcast audience?
7 Habits is one of the Bibles for me, and so I always, that's kind of my default go-to. There's so many of them. I think the key is how do we get to the foundation, and that's through fear and emotional intelligence. So I would go out and read Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence, or Travis Bradberry's, I think his name is Bradberry, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, because very briefly, all of this stuff is about us. It's about us getting past our stuff. Once you do that, you can do all kinds of stuff. You can do your sales, you can do your video podcast, you can do all kinds of things.
Good stuff. And final one from me, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling? It's
not about you. It's about the client. It's not about you. It's about a relationship with the client and their needs, meeting their needs.
Good stuff. Well, with that, Jo, tell us a little bit about your book and where the audience, so I'm sure they've had a right riot listening to this episode, where they can find out more about you as well.
So my website is jocerio.com, Joes like Sam, ERIO.com. My book is book series, Get the Nerve to Succeed, Overcoming Fear, 50 Lessons on Being Bold and Living the Dream, Public Speaking, 50 Lessons on Presenting Without Losing Your Cool, and Time Management, 50 Lessons on Finding Time for What's Important. On Amazon, on my website, autographed copies on my website, and Amazon.
Nice. Well, we'll link to all that in the show notes, along with the other books and the other resources that we mentioned throughout the show. And with that, Jo, thank you for your time, your energy as well, and thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Well, I was looking forward to it because you have an awesome show. I've watched a bunch of others, so thank you for doing a great show, and thanks for having me.
And there we have it. Jo, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you, Sales Nation, as always, for tuning in. I massively appreciate your attention. If you enjoyed this episode, you will love yesterday's episode with James Pember of Sparta Sales, where we're talking about sales software, gamification, and a whole lot more. So if you haven't already, make sure you watch or download that episode. And with that all said, I'll speak with you on tomorrow's show.